Welcome to the Cerner Hospitalist video training series. In this video, we'll talk about how to manage your problem list. The problem list, as I've mentioned in some of my earlier Cerner videos, is split into two parts. You've got a diagnosis, and the diagnosis in the problem list will, first of all, it'll be highlighted this visit in blue. And of course, a diagnosis can be both a diagnosis, this visit, and a chronic past medical history problem too. So it can be both. When you know it's a diagnosis when it's numbered, this is highlighted blue. Another tip-off is that if you have your screen in a split configuration as mine is, you'll see those same problems feed over to the problem list. So let's say I wanted to add maybe a nondescript problem. In fact, I've got one here, and what I'll show you here, just to show you how easily you can manipulate these in the workflow, is I'm going to unclick chronic, and I'm going to unclick this visit. Now I just removed that problem from my problem list and it also removed it from my assessment and plan. So let's say I want to add acute CHF, which I understand is fallen from favor. CHF is really no longer a favored way to call it heart failure. So I pull heart failure in. Notice because I had this selected as this visit, it automatically became a diagnosis. Right here. Now I can go ahead and make this a chronic problem if I'd like. Click here, so it can be both, or I can just make it a chronic problem and unselect this visit. I just click it. It's just on, off. You click it once, it'll turn it off. But you have to be careful because now if I were to click this last one here, it removes it completely from my workflow list. So you have to be very careful about selecting these things. So I'll go back and click this visit. Once again, it numbers it. I can change my numbering up quite easily. I can just click on this arrow, click number 1, pull it to the very top, and it will automatically renumber the others. Notice the little exclamation mark here. I can click on that exclamation mark and specify the problem. Let's blow this up a little bit. And it first gives you common codes and diagnoses down here. So you can specify it if it's a more constrained type of diagnosis. So there's only 20 here, but at some other types of diagnosis, you may have 150 choices. So that can get quite cumbersome. But if I knew this was a acute on chronic diastolic heart failure, I could click this one and use that as a diagnosis. But let's say I'm not certain, I can come up here and start with left ventricular failure, or let's say it's hypertensive heart disease. And I could say it's also due to chronic kidney disease. So as you know, that in the coding world, they combine chronic kidney disease and heart failure if hypertension is the cause of both disorders. So that's a good way to lead you in the right direction. But let's say they don't have that. I said hypertensive heart disease. Well, you see I don't have a clinical subset. There's temporality, chronic, and it leads to this diagnosis. Or once again, I can go back. Looks like I'll have to cancel this and try it again. Well, let's just say left ventricular failure. Or we can say systolic heart failure. Acute on chronic. And there's your code. Now there's one caveat here. Once you have specified your diagnosis, you have to go down here to set display as. You have to select from list and click the one that says ICD-10. and now say save. Then it will update your diagnosis once you have refreshed it. I'm just going to refresh this one component here, and it updates it to acute on chronic systolic heart failure. Cerner appears to be designed to assume if you change that diagnosis here, if I go here and do this, if I change the diagnosis up here and click on the one that I want here, that the coders will code from that new diagnosis, because it does not automatically set my diagnosis there. Say if I click here, it still will go with the older, less specific set display as. So it is obvious to me that Cerner intends for coders to use our electronic problem list for coding purposes. However, only the document that you create at the very end that displays this less specific diagnosis is codable according to our coding office here, our HIM department, because the only medical legal document is that note that you create that shows, in this case, fracture of prosthetic hip, as opposed to broken internal left hip prosthesis initial encounter. So unless you go here and say select from list and select it, the coders are still going to code this non-specific diagnosis. That has caused a lot of consternation among some on the medical staff who I spoke with this about. I'm not sure if there's any solution forthcoming here. I find it as a difficult thing to explain in the system, since you do all the work and yet you've still got to do 2 more clicks just to get credit for it. So anyway, so notice again, these feed over to here. One other complaint I get a lot is when specialists are working on your patients, consultants, this assessment and plan, because this problem list is the same regardless of the physician. It's the patient's problem list, so it doesn't matter who sees the patient, it will look the same. So if I'm a specialist coming in for GI and I say acute diverticulitis, and well, if I start taking out diagnoses up here, and I start unclicking things, I'll mess up the list for everybody, especially the hospitalist. But also my list here, if I'm the GI doctor or the surgeon or whoever is being consulted here, or the ID doctor, maybe the diagnosis I want to use is down here in my assessment and plan. So here's what is a temporary solution. You can change the numbering here if you're the specialist to number 1. And then you can go here to the assessment and plan and remove the other diagnoses that don't really apply. And that means that the hospitalist the next day might have to come back and change this number back to what they wanted. But at least that's a compromise. But under no circumstance should anybody start removing diagnoses here unless they're just out and out wrong or they need to be specified. And one other feature of the problem list that probably gets very little mention is you can go into the more detailed view by clicking problem list here, or go into the older menu and clicking problem list here. If I click the problem list and I go deeper into it, I get a view that looks fairly messy, because it shows everything. Every time I click this visit on and off again and re-add it, it brings it back and puts a line through it. It looks like a mess. So I'm going to just view the active diagnoses, and the same here, active. It's a little clearer to see that a diagnosis, these are the numbered problems that go to your assessment and plan, and the problems go to your past medical history. They're the chronic problems. But one thing that doesn't get mentioned is favorites for your problems. It's not available in the workflow. And I'm not so certain it gives you that much advantage. But if you did want to set some favorites, go here to the older problem list, click Add, and now click on your search window, the binoculars. Now I can start adding on chronic systolic heart failure. And let's say I wanted that to be my favorite. I can create a folder and say common diagnoses. And now I can go here and click the problem I want. And it adds it to my list. I say OK. And there it is. Back to my problem list. I can update it by clicking the refresh button. And there it is. Then I can remove it or make it a chronic problem. I can click that line, now it's gone. So you can use favorites as well on your problem list. I find that the problem list is probably the most difficult thing to deal with, and when you're first starting out in Cerner. It's really not that hard, especially within the workflow, but it gets a little tedious for some, and but it's designed to be something that we build up so that when the patients come in, we're not having to reinvent the wheel every time. So that will conclude this video. Thank you.